You walk into a room full of people you know. These aren't strangers. They're your friends, your family, your colleagues, people who love you, people you've chosen to have in your life. And yet, within 20 minutes, something starts happening inside your chest. A tightening, a heaviness that wasn't there when you walked in. By the time you leave, you feel like you've run a marathon, not physically. Something deeper, something in your bones. You get home, close the door behind you, and the first thing you do is sit in silence. Not because you want to think, because you need to recover. You need to remember who you are. I want you to stay with me here because this isn't about introversion. I know that's what you've been telling yourself. I know that's the comfortable label, the acceptable explanation. I'm just an introvert, you say. I need my alone time. And maybe that's partially true. But here's what I've come to understand after years of studying the human psyche and the work of Carl Jung. There's a difference between needing solitude because it nourishes you and needing solitude because other people have somehow drained the very life force out of you. The first is a preference, the second is a wound. And you know the difference. You felt it. There are times when you leave a gathering and you feel full, alive, connected to something larger than yourself. Those moments are rare, but they exist. But then there are the other times, the majority of times, when you leave feeling like someone reached inside you and took something without asking. When you spend the next day recovering not from activity, but from the invisible labor of simply being around other people. Jung called what happens in those moments something most people will never understand. He called it a leaking of psychic energy, not metaphorically, functionally. Something in the structure of your psychological self is bleeding out every time you enter certain social dynamics. And until you understand what's actually happening beneath the surface, you will spend your entire life believing you're broken, believing you're too sensitive, believing that everyone else seems to handle human connection effortlessly while you are somehow defective. You're not defective. You're caught in a psychological pattern that was set in motion long before you had words for it. And today, I want to show you exactly what that pattern is, where it came from, and what happens when you finally learn to stop the bleeding. The exhaustion you feel around others isn't a personality trait. It's a signal. And that signal is trying to tell you something about the way you've been forced to fragment yourself in order to survive. Let me tell you about a woman I knew years ago. I'll call her Sarah because she asked me never to use her real name. Sarah was the kind of person everyone described as warm, generous, always there for others. She was the friend who remembered birthdays, the colleague who noticed when someone was struggling, the daughter who called her mother every Sunday without fail. By all external measures, she was exceptional at human connection. But here's what no one saw. After every social interaction, no matter how small, Sarah would retreat to her car and sit in silence for 10, sometimes 20 minutes before she could drive home. She told me once that it felt like her insides had been scraped out, like she had given away parts of herself she couldn't afford to lose. She was 34 years old, and she was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Not exhausted from work, not exhausted from lack of rest, exhausted from being herself around other people. When I asked her what it felt like when she was with others, she said something that stopped me cold. She said, "I'm not there. I'm performing there. The person they see, the person they love, she's a character I play so well that I forgot she wasn't real. And the real me, she's somewhere in the back watching, waiting for permission to exist." What Sarah described without knowing it was the fracture between her authentic self and what Jung called the persona, the mask we wear to navigate the social world. But for Sarah, and perhaps for you, the mask had become so fused with her identity that wearing it was no longer a choice, it was a compulsion. And It was costing her everything. You see, the persona is supposed to be flexible. It's supposed to be a tool you pick up and put down depending on the context. When you're at work, you emphasize certain aspects of yourself. When you're with close friends, you emphasize others. This is healthy, this is normal. But something goes wrong when the persona becomes rigid. When it becomes the only version of yourself you're allowed to show. When the distance between who you really are and who you perform yourself to be grows so wide that simply existing in public becomes an act of psychological violence against your own soul. And here's the part that will hurt to hear. This usually happens because at some point in your life, your authentic self was not safe. The real you, the unfiltered you, the you that exists before performance, was met with rejection or criticism, or subtle signals that you were too much, too intense, too different, too something. And so you learned. You learned that survival meant becoming palatable, acceptable, easy to be around. You learned that love was conditional on presentation. Jung wrote something about this that I've never been able to forget. He said, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." Read that again. The persona is what you think you are. It's also what others think you are, but it's not what you actually are. And when you spend your entire life living from that false center, every interaction becomes a negotiation between who you're pretending to be and who you actually are. No wonder you're exhausted. You're running two operating systems at once, and one of them is slowly killing the other. But the persona is only half the story. Because what happens to the parts of yourself that the persona doesn't allow? What happens to your anger when you've learned to always be pleasant? What happens to your needs when you've learned to always be giving? What happens to your darkness when you've learned to always be light? Those parts don't disappear. They go somewhere. And where they go, Jung discovered, is into the shadow. The shadow is everything you've been taught to reject about yourself. It's not evil. That's a common misunderstanding. The shadow is simply what's been exiled. For some people, the shadow contains their aggression. For others, their sexuality. For still others, their ambition, their grief, their jealousy, their power. And here's the terrible irony. The more light your persona projects, the darker and denser your shadow becomes. If you've spent your life being the kind one, the accommodating one, the one who never makes waves, then somewhere inside you is a part that is furious about it. A part that wants to scream no. A part that is tired of carrying everyone else's emotional weight while no one thinks to carry yours. This shadow self doesn't just sit quietly in the basement of your psyche. It acts. It influences. And, most importantly for what we're discussing today, it responds to other people's shadows. There's a phenomenon that happens in social situations that explains so much of your exhaustion, and it's something most people never learn about. When you're around other people, you're not just interacting with their personas. You're also unconsciously engaging with their shadows, their unprocessed material, their denied selves. And if you're someone who developed a hypersensitive persona, meaning someone who learned early that survival meant reading the room perfectly, then you're likely also someone who feels other people's shadows without knowing it. Let me make this practical. You're at a family dinner. Your mother is smiling, being pleasant, but something underneath is off. She's carrying resentment she won't admit. Your father is making jokes, but there's a sadness in him he's never addressed. Your sibling is enthusiastic, but there's a competitiveness they've learned to hide. Consciously, everyone is fine, but unconsciously, the room is thick with unspoken material, and you feel all of it. You feel it in your body, in your chest, and the sudden urge to leave, to escape, to find somewhere you can breathe. What's happening is not introversion. What's happening is that you've become a sponge for unconscious content that doesn't belong to you. You've become the designated feeler for people who've learned to exile their feeling function. And because you never learned how to recognize the difference between your own psychic material and theirs, you absorb it. You carry it. And when you finally get home, you're not recovering from conversation. You're recovering from carrying everyone else's denied selves. Jung observed this pattern in his clinical work and came to a profound conclusion. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But what happens when one substance is porous and the other is sealed? What happens when one person has built walls so thick that nothing of their shadow leaks out, while the other has no walls at all? I'll tell you what happens. The porous one drowns. You felt this. You know exactly what I'm describing. You've walked away from certain people and felt inexplicably angry, inexplicably sad, inexplicably anxious, and later realized that you were carrying their unexpressed emotions. You've sat across from someone who was smiling and saying all the right things and felt a heaviness descend on you that you couldn't explain. You've wondered if you were going crazy. You weren't going crazy. You were picking up signals from the collective unconscious that most people are too defended to register. This is both your gift and your wound. And until you learn to differentiate between what's yours and what's theirs, you will continue to feel exhausted after every encounter with other humans. Not because people are draining, but because you haven't yet learned to keep your own energy inside your own container. Now, I need to take you deeper because understanding the pattern intellectually is not enough to change it. You need to see where this came from. There's a term in Jungian psychology called the wounded child archetype, and I suspect it's going to resonate with you more than you'd like it to. The wounded child is the part of you that experienced the original break. The first moment when you learned that being yourself was not okay. For some people, this was a single traumatic event. For most people, it was a series of small moments that accumulated into a single message. Who you are naturally is a problem. Maybe your emotions were too big for your family. Maybe your needs were inconvenient. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive, too needy, too loud, too quiet, too much, too little. The specific content doesn't matter as much as the conclusion you drew from it. Something about my authentic expression causes disconnection. Therefore, I must change my authentic expression to maintain connection. And so you built a persona. But here's what happens when a child builds a persona. They don't just add a layer on top of their true self. They exile parts of their true self into the shadow. And they lose access to those parts for decades, sometimes for a lifetime. Now fast forward to your adult life. You're carrying around a persona that was designed by a child to solve a child's problem. But you're no longer a child. The threats that once existed no longer exist in the same way. And yet, the machinery keeps running. Every time you enter a social situation, that old program activates. Scan the room. Identify what they need. Become what they need. Suppress what they can't handle. Perform. 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 And because that program runs automatically, below the level of conscious awareness, you don't even realize you're doing it. All you feel is the aftermath, the exhaustion, the emptiness, the vague sense that you've given something away that you can't get back. I want to share something with you that changed the way I understand this pattern. Jung developed a concept he called participation mystique, borrowed from anthropology. It describes a state where your psyche is not fully differentiated from the psyches of those around you. In indigenous cultures, this was sometimes described as a collective soul. But in modern individuals, especially those who grew up in enmeshed family systems, participation mystique shows up as an inability to know where you end and others begin. Think about what this means. If you can't feel where you end and others begin, then every social interaction becomes an unconscious merger. You don't just interact with people, you become porous with them. Their emotions seep in, their expectations become your obligations. Their unspoken needs become your unspoken responsibilities. And you do all of this without choosing it, without even realizing it's happening. This is why that cocktail party exhausts you. This is why family dinners leave you feeling like you need 3 days to recover. This is why even spending time with people you love can feel like work. You're not just being with them, you're merging with them. And then you have to spend hours or days regathering the fragments of yourself that got scattered in the process. A man I worked with once described it this way. He said, "When I'm around people, it's like I disappear. Not physically, but the sense of I goes away. I become whatever the situation needs me to be. And then, when I'm alone, I have to remember who I was before I walked into the room. That forgetting and remembering. That constant cycle of self-loss and self-recovery. That is what's exhausting you. It's not the people. It's the dissolution of your boundaries every time you're around them. Maybe for you it looks like this. You agree to plans and feel resentful the moment you make them. Not because you don't want to see the person, but because some part of you knows what it will cost. You know that you'll lose hours of your life, not just to the event, but to the recovery afterward. You know that you'll come home feeling less like yourself than when you left. Or perhaps you've noticed that certain people exhaust you more than others. Not the loud ones necessarily. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most draining, because they're carrying the most unexpressed material, and you, with your permeable boundaries, feel all of it pressing against you. There's a version of this that shows up in romantic relationships too. You merge with your partner so completely that you don't know what you want, only what they want. You don't know what you feel, only what they feel. And when the relationship ends, you feel not just heartbroken, but genuinely confused about your own identity, because you handed so much of yourself over that there's nothing left when they go. And then there's the version that happens when you're alone at night. You finally have solitude, but instead of peace, you feel empty. Not refreshed. Not yourself. Empty. Because you've been running on the persona's wheel for so long that you've lost access to the authentic self that should be waiting for you when the mask comes off. If you're recognizing yourself in this, I want you to leave one word in the comments. Just the word, seen. Not for me, for yourself. As a marker that today, you stopped pretending this was just introversion. Today, you looked at the real pattern. Now that you see it, the question becomes, what do you do with it? The path forward is not about becoming less sensitive. I need you to hear that clearly. Your sensitivity is not the problem. Your porosity is not a character flaw. It's a survival adaptation that became permanent. And the goal is not to harden yourself, to build walls so thick that nothing gets through. That would solve the exhaustion, but create a new problem: disconnection, isolation, a different kind of emptiness. The goal is something more subtle. The goal is to become what Jung called individuated, to become so fully yourself that you can be with others without losing yourself, to have boundaries that are flexible rather than rigid, to be able to feel what's in the room without absorbing it, to know, in every moment, what belongs to you and what belongs to them. This is not easy work, but it is the most important work you will ever do. The first shift that needs to happen is reclaiming the parts of yourself that have been exiled into the shadow. Those parts of you that were deemed unacceptable, that were pushed underground to make the persona possible, they contain energy you need. They contain life force. They contain capacities you've been cut off from for so long that you've forgotten they exist. I knew a woman who had spent her entire life being agreeable, sweet, accommodating, never a harsh word, never a raised voice, never a demand. And she was profoundly exhausted, not just from social interaction, but from life itself. When we started exploring her shadow, we found something she had completely disowned: her rage. Not anger, that was there in small doses. Rage. A primal fury at having been invisible for so long, at having twisted herself into knots for people who never asked her what she needed, at having lived a life designed around other people's comfort. When she first touched that rage, she was terrified. She thought if she let it out, she would destroy everything. She would become the monster she'd been told she was whenever she showed any sign of need or displeasure. But something remarkable happened when she learned to hold space for that rage without acting it out. She got her energy back. The exhaustion that had plagued her for years began to lift. Because that rage wasn't the problem. It was her life force trying to come back home. Jung said something about this that I keep coming back to. He wrote, "The shadow is 90% pure gold." What he meant is that the parts of ourselves we've rejected contain not just our darkness, but our vitality, our power, our capacity for authentic expression. And when we reclaim them, we stop bleeding out. We stop giving away pieces of ourselves every time we interact with others because we finally have a full self to operate from. The second shift involves recognizing the difference between empathy and absorption. These are not the same thing, though they feel similar. Empathy is sensing what another person feels while remaining in your own center. Absorption is sensing what another person feels and losing your center in the process. Think of it this way. Imagine you're standing on the shore of a lake. Empathy is seeing that the water is cold, maybe even dipping your hand in to feel the temperature. Absorption is falling into the lake and nearly drowning. Both involve contact with the water, but only one preserves your ability to stand on solid ground. There's an ancient Greek myth that illuminates this beautifully. The story of Persephone descending into the underworld. What's often missed in that story is that Persephone learns to navigate the underworld without becoming it. She eats the pomegranate seeds, yes. She becomes queen of the realm of the dead. But she also returns to the surface. She learns to move between worlds without losing herself in either one. This is the capacity you're learning to develop. The capacity to descend into another person's emotional reality, to see them fully, to feel them truly, and then to return to your own surface, to remain sovereign, to visit but not move in. The third shift involves what Jung called active imagination, though I want to describe it in practical terms. Active imagination is a practice of dialogue with the parts of yourself that have been operating unconsciously. It's a way of building a relationship with your shadow, your wounded child, the persona you've been wearing. Here's what this looks like in practice. When you come home exhausted from a social interaction, instead of just collapsing, you pause. You ask yourself, what just happened? Not externally. Internally. Which part of me showed up? Which part of me got suppressed? What did I need in that room that I didn't ask for? What did I give away that I couldn't afford to lose? You might even visualize these parts as distinct characters. The performer who smiles and entertains. The child who feels scared and wants to leave. The shadow who is furious that you're betraying yourself again. And you talk to them, you listen to them, you honor them. This might sound strange if you've never done it, but I can tell you that some version of this practice has been used by every wisdom tradition in human history. The Stoics dialogued with their future selves. Mystics spoke with divine figures. Shamanic cultures journeyed to meet spirit guides. What Jung added was the understanding that these figures are not external beings but autonomous complexes within your own psyche. And When you build a relationship with them, you stop being controlled by them. There's one more piece to this that I think you need to hear, and it has to do with your nervous system. Because this isn't just psychological, it's physiological. When you grew up in an environment where you had to constantly monitor other people's emotional states, your nervous system adapted. Your body learned to be in a constant state of low-level vigilance. Your cortisol levels calibrated to the expectation of threat. And, even now, even when you're safe, your body doesn't know it. This is why solitude feels so necessary after social interaction. Your nervous system is finally getting a chance to downregulate, to drop out of fight or flight, to remember that you're not in danger. But if you never address the underlying pattern, the one that keeps activating the vigilance, you'll need more and more solitude to compensate. The work, then, is twofold. It's psychological, meeting the exiled parts, differentiating yourself from others, reclaiming your boundaries. And it's somatic, teaching your nervous system that you can be in the presence of others without being in danger, that you can feel what's in the room without being responsible for fixing it, that you can remain in your own body even when there's intensity around you. If this is landing for you, share this video with someone who's going through their own version of this. Not because I need the views, but because there's someone in your life right now who thinks they're broken because they can't do what everyone else seems to handle effortlessly. They need to know there's a name for what they're experiencing. They need to know there's a path through. I want to tell you what becomes possible on the other side of this work. Not as a fantasy, not as a promise, but as something I've witnessed again and again in people who were willing to do the hard labor of integration. The first thing that changes is the quality of your solitude. Right now, when you're alone, there's an emptiness underneath the relief, a sense that you're recovering rather than living. But when you begin to reclaim the exiled parts of yourself, when you start operating from an authentic center rather than a constructed persona, your solitude transforms. It becomes rich, full. Not an absence of others, but a presence of yourself. You'll be sitting somewhere ordinary, a park bench, your kitchen table, and you'll feel something you haven't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, something quieter, something more real. A sense that you are finally in the right place, that you are not performing existence but actually having it. The second thing that changes is your capacity for connection. This is the beautiful paradox. When you stop merging with others, when you stop absorbing their shadows and carrying their unexpressed needs, you actually become capable of deeper intimacy. Because now you're meeting them as yourself, not as the persona designed to make them comfortable, not as the hollow shell left behind after years of giving yourself away, but as a full human being with edges and centers and desires of your own. I worked with a man for 3 years who had come to believe that he was incapable of true closeness. He described himself as broken, wired wrong. He loved his wife but felt strangely alone with her. He had friends but never felt truly known. What we discovered slowly was that he had been so merged with others for so long that there was no him to show up in relationship. He was always adapting, always shape-shifting, always becoming what he thought the other person needed. And because of this, he was never actually present. The work he did was painful. He had to grieve all the years spent performing. He had to feel the rage he'd suppressed since childhood. He had to learn in his 40s what it meant to have boundaries. But something remarkable happened. As he became more himself, his relationships became more real. His wife said she felt like she was meeting him for the first time. His friends noticed a steadiness in him that hadn't been there before. And most importantly, he stopped being exhausted. Not because he was avoiding people, but because he was no longer disappearing every time he was with them. This is what Jung meant when he talked about individuation, the process of becoming fully yourself. It's not selfish. It's not isolation. It's the only path to genuine connection. Because you cannot give what you do not have. And you cannot have yourself if you've given yourself away to everyone else. Jung wrote something near the end of his life that I think about often. He said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Those words sound simple. But for someone who has spent their life being what others needed them to be, those words are revolutionary. They're an invitation to a completely different way of existing. What I want you to understand is that the exhaustion you've been feeling is not a verdict. It's not proof that you're too weak for this world. It's the natural consequence of living a certain way, a way you didn't choose, a way that was forced on you by the circumstances of your early life. And it can be undone. Not overnight. Not through some magical insight that fixes everything. But through the slow, patient work of reclaiming yourself piece by piece. It won't be perfect. You'll still have hard days. There will still be situations that drain you, people whose energy feels toxic no matter how much work you do. But the quality of those hard days will be different because you will be different. You'll know what's yours and what's theirs. You'll know when to stay and when to leave. You'll know when you're performing and when you're actually present. And here's the part I want you to hold on to. You are closer to this than you think. The very fact that you felt the exhaustion so acutely means your psyche has been trying to get your attention. The discomfort is the signal. The fatigue is the alarm. Some part of you has been screaming, "This isn't right, this isn't me, this costs too much." And today, maybe for the first time, you finally heard it. I want to take you back to where we started. That room full of people you know. Those friends, those family members, those colleagues. You walk in and the old machinery begins to activate. The scanning, the adapting, the performing. But now imagine something different. Imagine that you walk in and you stay. Not the persona. You. Imagine that you can feel the unspoken tension in the room, but you don't pick it up. It belongs to them. Imagine that you can sense someone's neediness or judgment, but you don't contort yourself to fix it. It's their work, not yours. Imagine that you speak, and what comes out is not calculated to please but authentic. True to what you actually think, actually feel, actually want. And imagine that when you leave, you don't feel scraped out. You don't need 3 days to recover. You feel tired perhaps. The natural tiredness of having been present, but you don't feel empty. Because you didn't give yourself away. You didn't disappear, you remained whole. This is not introversion's opposite. This is not becoming an extrovert who thrives on crowds. This is something else entirely. This is becoming a person who can tolerate intimacy with others because you have intimacy with yourself. A person who can give generously because you're giving from overflow, not from your reserves. A person who can be alone and feel full and be with others and still feel full. Jung had a phrase for this. He called it the transcendent function. The capacity to hold opposing forces in balance. To be open without being porous. To be sensitive without being permeable. To be giving without being depleted. That's what awaits you. Not a cure for sensitivity, but a transformation of what sensitivity means. Not an escape from human connection, but a completely different experience of what human connection can be. Type the words, "I am learning to stay," not as a wish, as a declaration. Let it be the first thing you say out loud about who you're becoming. The room will always be full of people carrying unspoken things. The world will always be thick with unconscious material. This will not change. But you can change. You can become someone who walks through all of it without losing yourself. Someone who feels deeply but does not drown. Someone who gives generously from a full cup. Someone who comes home after being with others and finds waiting there in the silence A self that is still intact, still present, still whole. That is not a fantasy. That is your birthright. And the exhaustion you've been carrying, it's been the labor pains of this new self trying to be born. Let it be born now.